Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Republica Live with me, Christopher Weiger. This evening, a special guest. It's Paul Caruana, Galizia, author of the book A Death in Malta. We'll be back right after this. Once again, a warm welcome to all our followers, and thanks for tuning in to another edition of Republica Live with me, Christopher Weiger. Today, our special guest is Paul Caruana, Galizia, who's the author of the recent publication A Death in Malta. Paul, thanks for joining us. Paul, today we have the benefit of not having to re-explain where Malta is, who Daphne Caruana Galizia is, who Robert Abela is. But we do have the more challenging task of indeed challenging our audience, who are undoubtedly big fans of your mother's work and now also of your work, and bringing them something new. But this has also meant that you had to do lots of this explaining so far. I mean, you've been on BBC Hard Talk, you've been on Amanpour, you've also been at the European Parliament, sort of during this book tour. Which has been the most memorable experience so far?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And it is quite nice that I don't have to explain where Malta is and who my mother was. I don't know what the most memorable part of the book tour has been. Each one has been different, and you speak at a bookshop in London and people there are more interested in the process of writing and researching the book. Whereas, of course, on TV shows like Hard Talk or Amanpour, the audience is different and you speak to different aspects of the story. And I think, that shows just how long running and complicated the story is, that it's one that folds in a person's life with a country's rule of law crisis, with being part of this much wider global trend in corruption and problems journalists face reporting on it. And I wonder, I wonder now what I can talk about in this talk with such an informed audience. But you will guide me, I hope.
Well, I hope so too, and we'll figure it out by the end of it, hopefully. And yeah, maybe it's worth highlighting that we are doing this interview live. We already received some questions from some of you guys following us, but if you have more questions, submit them in the comment section, and if we'll have time, we'll get to them. Paul, so what did you hope to achieve with this book?
So the aim is stated really on the first page, where I say that the book is to introduce readers to my mother before she's lost again. And I started in a half-hearted way working on the book about 4 years ago. And then, for various reasons, a lot of them to do what was with happening in Malta, it was delayed and delayed again. But I think over this whole period, I felt that her murder had grown bigger than her life, and that certainly people outside Malta really only knew her as the victim of a murder and as collateral in this wider corruption crisis the country's facing. But of course, because I am her son, and not just a journalist, I'm a journalist and her son, I knew the story was very different. And I knew that her life was so much richer and fuller than those accounts and court reports let on. And I wanted to kind of get on the record what she was like and where she came from and what drove her, which was a funny project, I realized, because in the end I didn't even know many of those things. And so for me personally, it was a similar project of discovery, finding out how she got started in journalism and why, what she was like as a girl, how she met my father, and all the rest of it. But the aim remained the same, that I really wanted people to meet her and understand what she was about. And I hope they have a sense of that, and also that it kind of heightens the sense of theft, that she really was an extraordinary person, and she was killed.
It is indeed a great service because it's she's a person who we're reading about basically weekly in the media, and she was stolen obviously from you, and also a whole generation, myself included. I never had the chance to meet her, unfortunately, but now a whole generation doesn't know who she is. But hopefully, her memory will indeed live on through your pages. If she were to read these pages, what do you think she'd think about them? What would the reaction be to your book?
I don't know. I think she might be a bit embarrassed in parts. No one likes their private life to make it onto the pages of a book. But I mean, that was a difficult question, and a very uncomfortable one. If I weren't her son, I would say this is a project where I'm writing about a person and I have to cover all parts of their life. But as her son, I felt, what are the limits of it? How much do people know? How much is relevant to the story? What would she think of it? I wonder. I mean, I hope she would think first that it's a story well told, and the book had to do that in the first place, that it had to draw people in. It had to make people who feel they know the story think actually there's more to it. It had to be a different kind of a book for people who aren't Maltese and haven't been reading the news reports for the past 6 years. I hope she'd think that it is something of a testament to her and to this extraordinary life she's lived, cut short, but an extraordinary life, and that she has left me and my brothers a really astonishing legacy. And I hope, I'd hope she'd see that in the book.
You did contribute new things for sure in that. Yeah, some paragraphs I found myself sort of finishing them with you, but others it was like great nuggets of behind the scenes part of big elements we just saw in the media and now have a different perspective of you in the meeting while people were protesting in the street. And it's highly recommended for people from Malta as well. I mean, just for the, I won't reveal what's said, but just for the Holy Communion episode, the book is worth buying just to read that piece. You mentioned that, yeah, not many people enjoy having their private lives splashed on pages of books. Your mother happened to splash the lives and misdeeds of many people on her blog. So I'm sure many people didn't like having their secret companies revealed by that. When you were on Hard Talk, Stephen Secker pushed you a bit on your mother's, so to say, less newsy writing. Would you think your mother would have been as successful as she was in Malta if she were to be working in a place like the US, where many journalists have the supposed claim to objectivity, which they stand by?
It's a good question. I look, one thing that became clear to me in writing the book and is in the book is that my mother really resisted Maltese political and social life growing up, and was actually very disaffected by it as a teenager and even throughout her 20s. And it was her kind of fighting against those things that made her the kind of journalist she was. The sense of frustration with Malta's culture of silence and secrecy and fear, and not upsetting your third cousin or fourth cousin or whatever else. And she quite, she set out from the start to say, this is not what I want and not what I want the country to be. And in other countries, those barriers weren't there. So it might have produced a different journalist. We just don't know. What we do know is this, that her ability as a journalist is not one that made her stand out in Malta, but made her stand out really everywhere. And I always, of course, I knew what she was working on and how she worked on stories, but it's only, I'm embarrassed to say, until much later, first of all, until I became a parent myself and started working as a journalist myself, that I realized how difficult the job must have been under that extreme pressure, legal, political, social, to have three children and to keep testing these boundaries and advancing them. And if you have that kind of drive, if you have that kind of ability, then your limits are really your audience, I suppose. In the end, for her they were stretched out because the country's problem became international problem. You know, a vector, a recipient of global illicit financial inflows, and the vehicle for them. And she was read everywhere.
In your book, you describe the incident during your meeting with the former Justice Minister Owen Bonici, in which you describe the frustration which was building in the room where he was proposing names of judges which were simply not acceptable for anyone who wasn't, basically Joseph Muscat. And in the end, you sort of, well, the overreaction was only that you sort of raised your voice a bit, but that ended up with you getting your father sort of pointing it out at that. And sort of, do you feel that this is also part of from your mother's upbringing, that you were held to these higher standards where other people were allowed to get away with corruption, with going to strip clubs on government business, opening 100 libel suits against people? Do you feel like your upbringing was always being held to higher standards than the rest of the country?
I No, I think my mother would have quite liked me raising my voice at the Justice Minister. I think um I don't think that I think look, I meet people. I grew up in Malta. I go back for vigils and protests. I go back for court. I meet people just like me. I meet people who are horrified and shocked by these things. I mean, my mother was a journalist and she wrote about them. I I think there are two things. The first is that there are people who recognize these problems but feel fatalistic about them, and I certainly would count a lot of people I know as being that, and a lot of people I grew up with as well. And I think my mother was determinedly not fatalistic, and was never kind of beaten down by those low standards. Um, the the thing though about that meeting, and why I really wanted it in the book, is is to show just how fundamentally um, unimpressive and weak a lot of our public officials are. And I know to a lot of people on this call that will seem like the obvious, but it never really hit me, believe it or not, until that moment. And just how awful how degrading the experience was, that you had the justice minister at a time like that, and he was just hopeless and weak and um just a total henchman. As I say in the book, he was just writing on these little yellow post-its, and then I realized they're just to take back to Muscat. And I remember thinking, what is the point of you? What is the and sitting next to him, the then deputy AG, not making a sound. And it's just one of these moments where you realize how that institutions are ultimately made up of individuals. Unfortunately, in our case, they were made up of individuals like Owen Bonici, and it was just the most dispiriting thing. And um, Republica has has its own experience with him. And also another thing is, I realized in that meeting, it's of course not Owen Bonici who wanted the memorial cleaned up at 3 o'clock in the morning while no one's looking. It was Muscat making him do it. Who else would it have been? Who else would have been issuing those orders? And of course, Owen Bonici, it's just a headache for him, and but he would do it anyway. And I again, it was degrading is the word. The experience degraded him. It degraded our our institutions, our government, and it degraded us. It was not a happy meeting.
Can imagine. Your entire family have basically become unwilling expert victims in the Maltese justice system. I mean, you've become the victims end of numerous court cases. Even just have to mention one, the cases in which people admitted to carrying out the murder. You've become at the victim's end of a public inquiry. So I'm curious to understand, how does the Maltese justice system treat its victims?
I mean, in summary, very badly, and it starts from the beginning. So in many countries, for example, families of murder victims are assigned a police liaison officer for obvious reasons. It's good for everyone. The family wants to be kept updated. The police should update the family. It's a good relationship to have. It might produce very good information as well. In Malta, we have none of it. We just don't have that idea. Um, when it comes to the magisterial inquiry, you're locked out of it like everyone else, right? They're conducted in secret, the report is secret. So again, you're locked out of another form of inquiry. If you are so lucky that your case makes it to court, then you are in for a whole other world of difficulty. Um, we have this system we have of a compilation of evidence, in my opinion, needs to end. And for various reasons. First, I don't think it's consistent with the idea of a jury trial, because all of the evidence is heard in public before you ever get to trial. Secondly, it always favors the defendant, because there are so many delays, so many opportunities for frustrating the process, so many opportunities for stirring up conspiracy theories outside the court. It will always favor the defendant. And third, because it is painful. It is unbelievably painful. Jorgen Fenech was charged at the end of 2019. Sometimes I have to remind myself that it's been 6 years, and that there are people there are children in Malta. Again, it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but someone who was 12 then is now an adult, and like I don't know how that works for such a public case, for one that's heard in the public, reported on, and so on. But for a family, it is certainly very difficult, certainly very painful, and it's become another war. It's probably been one of the hardest parts of it for all these reasons. That between the delays, the opportunities to frustrate procedures, to kind of drip feed evidence heard in secret to people who can then spin totally wild conspiracy theories about them. It has been very difficult, very unpleasant. And there is the number of very good magistrates and judges in the country is small, and it's certainly too small to cope with the kind of corruption that's engulfing the country.
I think ultimately the system doesn't work because there are people who don't want it to work. Because whenever we need to find, €1 million for a direct order or 100,000 to satisfy a corrupt crony with a contract, we always seem to manage these things in record time. It's also an uphill battle in sense of the public inquiry recommendations still remain unfulfilled. You're still awaiting full justice for your mother's murder. So it's clear that, for instance, in Malta, the authorities, they're not going to be moving ahead on their own steam. What can the wider European journalistic community do to identify potential issues, such as a journalist being threatened with a significant risk that she might be murdered, to step in and become that preventative shield so that things don't escalate? What can the wider European community of journalists do?
So just quickly on your point on the justice system not working because ultimately the people who control it don't want it to work. Of course, that is true, and I so when we think specifically about that, Robert Abela talking about the inquiry into Muscat and him talking about delays and so on, in the same way Muscat used to talk about magistrates and inquiries, that is obviously a scandal, and the system doesn't belong to them. And our campaigning has always been about trying to create enough space within the judiciary, within the police force, so the people with integrity in those institutions, the honest people in them, feel they have the safety, the space to do the work they are empowered to do. And of course, Robert Abela is doing the exact opposite. He's trying to limit that space. He's trying to make them feel like they cannot do the work properly, fairly, and openly. Now, on your question, and journalists in the wider European community, it leads perfectly into this. So in the campaign, again, the goal was always to create that space. In fact, some of the first people we spoke to were journalists. Initially, journalists on The Guardian, and then from Reuters, and then many more journalists over many, many months. In the end, it proved to be one of the most effective things because they constantly cover what's happening in a country, but they can say things. They can say things in ways that officials perhaps can't. But central to the campaign has, on journalist safety specifically, has been this message that the best way to protect journalists is to act on their allegations. Everyone on this call will know what a bizarre situation it was in Malta, where my mother would report these really, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Energy Minister own Panama companies. There would be a protest, there would be outrage, but nothing really happened, right? Nothing happened. Still nothing is happening. That was February 2016. February 2016. and we all kind of live with it. They're still out. They're still doing whatever they're doing. And there is no greater danger to journalists than that situation, because we saw it with my mother. The war ends up being between the journalist and, in Malta's case, extremely dangerous people. There was no layer of police officers, magistrates, other politicians. It was just Schembri, Mitzi Muscat, Jorgen Fenech versus, as they used to say, one woman and a laptop.
Indeed, but luckily she had an international network of spies, and now they've been converted
Yes.
to supporters. Okay, one more question off topic, which is not directly to the book, and then we'll get back to the book. And just a reminder that people have around 15 minutes, so if you have any burning questions, send them in now. Now you're working as a journalist in the UK, and you've been exposing the murky financial dealings in London. You've also been exposing the Russian influence in the House of Lords. These are all wild stories. So what's your perspective now about the stories which we hear about in Malta? Are they truly incomparable when many people say Malta is not a normal country? I mean, looking at the reporting you're doing from the UK, I'm also getting a bit worried about that poor bastion of the sort of smaller sister or brother of the USA as the bastion of the free world. Sort of, what's your
I
sense of that now?
mm, I I think Malta is many orders of magnitude worse, and I you know I have seen it, right? I've seen it in the criminal proceedings, in the public inquiry hearings, and of course, people on this call will have daily experiences of it. I think the problems we have in Malta are systemic, and the cases you mentioned, there are systemic issues here, of course, but at the end of the day, it was one member of the Lords who I did a story about. I can probably do People can probably do a few more stories about them, but at the end of the day, the system mostly works, and um, it keeps a lot of problems out. It's quite good at controlling them. Parliament here is very strong. The judiciary is strong. There are many other problems, but those institutions work. They mostly work. They could work a lot better. In Malta, you certainly don't have that feeling. And the feeling that the institutions are rickety, under resourced, bullied by the executive, those are real. They're not just, I don't need to tell anyone on this, those are not just impressions, they're very real. And we were so determined on the public inquiry because we knew my mother's murder was the product of this total systemic failure. And that's what the public inquiry revealed in public, in open hearings, in a public report. And I think Malta is is again orders of magnitude worse. That line in the public inquiry report that Malta was on its way to becoming a completely entrenched mafia state is right. It is right. If Muscat saw through another 2 years, I mean, imagine the country then. Imagine if the protests didn't force out Mitzi and Muscat, and it's a horrifying thought. And we are very close to it. We didn't get a replacement that's much better, unfortunately, but I mean, it is a problem. But the really important thing, and in my opinion, the really permanent and lasting change is the development of civil society in Malta, right? Something, and this is a big part of the book, a big theme in the book. It never quite existed. It was always the political parties or the church or trade unions. But to have a truly civil society is what you need, and um, it really came to me in the constitutional case, we filed to have Silvio Valletta removed from the murder investigation. And the government was determined to close those hearings. And in the end, the judge, Silvio Meli, ruled no, the hearings should be open. And he said, because the public is an injured party too. And I thought, that's it. The public is an injured party. The institutional collapse, the nature of the murder, the motives of the murder. And it was very important to us that people feel invested in the campaign and that people see it in that way. And that's what you need to change. And that's what is really different here, I suppose. That it's less tribal. Civil society is very strong, the press is very strong, and those things really matter.
I think it does, because if an MP or a minister is indeed splashed on the front pages in the UK, everyone's talking about, then usually stuff does happen in Malta. I mean, your mother's blog was running for what, since 08 till 2017, 10 years, and yeah, stuff did happen,
Yes,
but
exactly.
not enough. Okay, back to the book, last 15 minutes. So, bear with me. I have a feeling that many of your mother's fans or super fans probably had a feeling that she was this invincible person. And I think that a tiny part of this image shattered with her murder in October 2017, when we saw that, well, she was actually a human just like us. But then, immediately after, she sort of got another sense of invincibility, in that since 2017 till now, every week the political news and just the news cycle and just stuff happening in Malta has been either a direct consequence of her reporting, be it on Vitals, be it on the Electro Gas Project 17 Black, or either that or more fallout from her murder. But in your book, you also spend quite some time and some paragraphs revealing on how vulnerable and stressed and angry and tired she often was. And me as a reader and as a fan, I appreciated that fly on the wall feeling of getting to know your mother better. But weren't you at all worried writing this that you're sort of satisfying the people who actually did want to make your mother feel stressed and did want to make your mother feel afraid, that you're showing them that, well, actually you did succeed in your mission?
Yes, I suppose I see what you mean, but look at the mission, right? What was the mission? Was the mission to destroy a woman? And you want to expose that. And if you're not, then the question is, who are you really protecting by hiding the effects of their propaganda, of their legal assault, and ultimately their car bombing? Then who are you protecting? And one of the hardest parts of the writing was that graphic description of her murder, and I agonized over it a lot. But at the end of the day, I thought to myself, no, this is what they did, and it must be shown in all its ugliness. And if I don't, then people will be able to kind of allow it to fade away, or to think it was clean or not as ugly or not as bad, when in fact it was completely grotesque. And I wanted that on the record. And I wanted people to see how that person so full of life could be affected by such powerful and ugly sources. And that was very important to me. I saw it as a way of exposing them, rather than painting her in this light or that. I felt that was very important to me, because I realized, of course, we saw it at home, but few other people knew the effects of all those libel suits that in the end went nowhere, the arson attacks, people only saw that she kept going, and it gave them the wrong idea. I think it gave them the wrong idea, not just of her, but of the people she was up against and just how bad they were.
And unfortunately, many of them are still around. Joseph Muscat
Yes.
making his return back to our gracing us with his presence again. And the whole cast of characters, Justin Caruana, Rosine Cotayer, anyways. A question I received from the audience prior to the show was, how has the book helped people outside of Malta understand the situation on the island better?
I well, I think not many people realize how bad things are. I think shock. I think is the summary word. I think obviously everyone knows things are rotten in a country where you have a car bombing like that. But I think the depth of corruption, the extent of it, the failure to control it, I think the kind of impunity enjoyed by Muscat and his government, I think that people reading that in the book, people outside Malta reading that in the book has created genuine shock, which wouldn't have been conveyed in a kind of foreign dispatch in the Times or on the BBC.
I think it gives you time to really soak in who your mother was, literally from her birth until her final moments. So you feel like you're growing up with her, I think, and living all, well, trying to live a percentage of what she and you guys lived through. So I think that does indeed really help. When you were writing up the book, sort of which vision of an audience did you keep in mind as you're writing it? Like, who were you imagining would be reading this kind of book?
Ah, I I spent a lot of time thinking about questions like that. You know, how to pitch it, how much detail, how much background on Malta. Um, it was a funny thing because for me personally, the most important readership is Malta. You know, by far and away, for very personal reasons, for reasons that have to do with the campaign and the ongoing fight against corruption. But ultimately, most readers I knew wouldn't be in Malta just because of the scale of the market outside Malta. I and so I thought I had to do two things. I had to write about Malta um, in a way that Maltese people maybe hadn't hadn't thought, a kind of fresh way at looking at the country's history, telling that narrative, and 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 using that narrative to explain where we are and weaving in my family's history, and then write it in a way that wouldn't be too detailed for people outside Malta. And so the book I thought had to do those two things at once. That it had to tell two parallel stories, and in the way, by historical accident, it kind of worked because she was born as independent Malta was born, and her own family was affected by the political upheavals of the 70s and 80s. She became a journalist because of those upheavals, and so it kind of worked. In the end, it didn't feel forced at all, um, and again, it took long. I don't want to give people the impression it just sort of came out of me one night. It went through draft after draft. Um, mm,
And I guess the book is itching for a sequel in that, yeah, we're now still living on what's happening, the public inquiries, the recommendations still get to be fulfilled, full justice for your mother's murder still to be sought, sort of. What would the second book, showing a success of what little can come out of this be like, to make you at least feel a bit more at ease and less stressed about the situation, the describing the aftermath of this horrible ordeal?
Well, first of all, maybe one of my brothers can write the sequel. Um, I hope we'll soon be able to write a book about exactly what we've been going through in the criminal proceedings, particularly against Jorgen Fenech, who is one of those thankfully rare things, a complete monster. And understandably, people are focused on the men who were, and some of whom remain, our public officials, because those are our public officials. But it's difficult to express just how actually evil Fenech is, and the kind of fight has been running in court, and how uneven the arms are, that we're kind of bound to play by the rules. But Fenech and his lawyers are just completely out of control. And there is something horrible and amazing that this man, who at the end of the day isn't much older than me, with the help of, you know, Muscat, Mitzi, and Schembri, mainly, brought a country and the society to this point. But if that second book, if one of my brothers writes that second book and it has some kind of an arc, you'd want the arc to be that, to dip at that point, but to rise with Maltese society claiming the country back. I believe we will get there. And it's funny because maybe it's because my brothers and I started from the lowest possible point, and that we saw we really saw the worst in everything and in many people. But the changes that have happened, some incremental, some enormous, are radical to us. You have to People have to remember, we started off from a point where we thought we just wouldn't get anywhere. We really thought that at points, and the campaigning was just to keep going. I and I For us, the most heartening thing has been to see these vigils and protests and the continued campaigning, because in the earliest moments we felt completely alone. um, and I think once you get people to really see things as belonging to them, and not the prime minister or the executive, but to them, that it's their country, and you can't have a prime minister telling a magistrate how to behave, or how you should protest, or what journalists should write. It's hard to reverse that kind of thinking. I think it's hard. I hope it's a permanent change, and it's you hope it runs through the civil service, that you see it is possible to be a good police officer, a good judge, and that everyone gains from it. And you know what I mean? Apathy and fatalism are contagious, but the opposites are also contagious. And I think, I don't know. I'm hopeful.
That's great to hear. I think many people will appreciate that you are hopeful, because I think if it wasn't for you and Andrew and Matthew and the rest of your extended family, I think your initial fears would have become a reality, in the sense that it is owing to your perseverance, which inspires us all, and we're still shocked at it now, at you managed to achieve what you've achieved so far. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, yes, we were prevented from slipping further down the route of the mafia state, but at the expense of you losing your mother. And that is indeed very sad. But Paul, Thanks very much for being with us and for writing this lovely book, which I encourage everyone on this call to read. And we hope to speak to you again soon when either Andrew or Matthew have written that sequel.
Thank you so much. I really enjoy it, and thank you so much for everyone who joined this call and wrote such kind things in the comments, which I'm reading now. That's really moving. Okay, thank you, Christoph. It's been a real
Thanks,
pleasure.
Paul. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone, for following another edition of Republica Live with me, Christoph Schweiger. Keep following Republica's socials to be informed of further shows such as this one. I wish you all a pleasant evening.